These are one-sentence reviews of all the books we read in 2025.
Starting with classics, I read The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. It was confusing, heartbreaking, beautiful, genius writing about time and how it affects different people. Then I also read The Gambler by Dostoyevsky, one of his weaker books in my opinion, but still thought it was thought-provoking and actually quite funny at times.
I read this collection of short stories called Babylon Revisited by Fitzgerald, and this short story collection is the best Fitzgerald I've ever read, and his story, The Glass-Cut Bowl, absolutely destroyed my soul in the best possible way.
I also felt that way about Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. It was masterful writing, philosophical, a perfect shorter novella that you can read in a sitting or two about a man struggling with the finality of life.
This year I read 2 Thomas Hardys. I started with Jude the Obscure. It was one of the saddest books I've ever read, with a shocking turn so brutal it made me gasp out loud, although there's huge trigger warnings for this book. Then I read Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It was more frustrating than devastating compared to Jude. This novel just made me want better things for Tess at every turn.
And then I also read Finnegans Wake, which was quite the feat for me. It was quite hard to get through at times, but it might be my new favorite book of all time as well. Beautiful writing, and if read aloud, sounds musical, and Joyce just kind of drowns you in symbolism, and there's always something more to get out of it. And then I also read Candide, which was witty, satirical, deals with the problem of evil, but probably wouldn't read it again. Wasn't as good as I hoped it'd be.
Then I reread 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger. This is one of my favorite collections of short stories and one of my favorite Salinger books. And it was even better the second time. I think everyone should read Salinger at least once.
And then another shorter book, The Old Man and the Sea by Hemmingway. Amazing story of a man's last challenge before the end of his life. And I would say just read it. It's good. Oh, and then my next bigger book that I read this past year was Bleak House. Very slow burn, convoluted, and the frustrations of bureaucracy, money, and so many stories that eventually intertwine with a chilling ghost story that sets the background. Probably one of the best endings to a book I've read too. And then keeping in that thread of Dickens, I also read Great Expectations. This is one of his more fast-paced books about a young man who gets a large fortune from an anonymous person, and he has no idea why. And this comes with luxuries, but many problems as well.
Then we both read Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. I genuinely loved this book, and it completely justified the patience and commitment it demands from the reader.
Yeah, there's definitely some slower chapters. But yeah, I thought it was incredible prose, themes, philosophical meanderings, and yeah, there's that whale thing that we're after. It's too bad Melville didn't get the praise and success that he deserved in his life. If only he could see the impact this book made on the Western canon. Pretty amazing. Another experimental book I read was Tristram Shandy, which was kind of it read like a modernist book, but from the 18th century, so it was very interesting in that way. Very funny, masterfully written, and Stern makes you just keep reading without virtually nothing going on in the plot at all.
I read a book where everything goes on in the plot. This was The Hearing Trumpet by Leonora Carrington. It's a wildly bizarre and brilliant journey toward enlightenment and apocalypse through the eyes of a hard-of-hearing 90-year-old woman, and one of the weirdest and best books I've ever read. I now want to read everything Carrington wrote.
I also read Chess Story, which is short, fast-paced, keeps you on the edge of your seat, and it's philosophical, and it has a lot to do with ideas that aren't really about chess. But yeah, that's another one I don't want to spoil, so you should just read it.
A short story I read was Mary Ventura and the Ninth Kingdom by Sylvia Plath. This is a haunting allegory that lingers in your mind long after you've finished it, and I also can't really give it away.
And then I read Dracula. Very captivating at the start of the novel, but after the first few chapters, I felt like it kind of fell off and dragged way too long for me. Still enjoyed it, especially with the movie adaptations that I've seen. It was nice to compare the two, but I probably wouldn't read it again. And then The Trial by Kafka. We both love Kafka's works. It was funny, classic of his style, about a man who's convicted of a crime. He or anyone doesn't know what the crime is. The second half brings a metaphorical story that comes out of nowhere about life and religion and has a devastating ending, yet the book is unfinished. So that was an interesting one for sure.
Then we both read Middlemarch by George Eliot.
Yeah, probably the best depiction of human character in a novel that I've read. You really feel like you're a fly on the wall in the 19th century of like London, and just written with real intelligence.
I thought so. By about page 400, I was completely won over by this rich, deeply human novel filled with characters I both loved and hated. But it took me about 400 pages to like this book, so it was a big commitment.
Slow burn, for sure. I carried on my tradition of reading A Christmas Carol. I try and do that every year, so that was my third reread. And I think I'll always cherish that book and Tiny Tim and the Cratchit family. And then I read Steppenwolf, a great psychological novel about the torments of the mind and life's mundanity, but ultimately finding happiness in what to live for. And then another Herman Hesse book called Siddhartha, and he explores the meaning of life through his character Siddhartha, which is also the name of Buddha, but the character that he writes about isn't actually Buddha and just lives in the same time period and place as Buddha, which is kind of interesting. And it's a perfect example of why people need to slow down and be quiet and listen more.
Next up is the sci-fi and fantasy category. I tend to read a lot of sci-fi. So I started off with The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor. This is a thoughtful post-humanist novel about interspecies communication that I finished already wanting to reread. In fact, I just finished rereading it right now. And it's one of my favorite books of all time. Then I reread The Giver Quartet. So this was a powerful, nostalgic reread from childhood. And the messages in those books still hold up. I especially loved books 1, 3, and 4. I was a bit underwhelmed with book 2. Speaking of being underwhelmed, I read The Buried Giant. And I had already read Clara and the Sun by the same author, but this book was slow-paced and underwhelming, and it never quite delivered on the themes it was trying to explore, and that surprised me from this author. I also reread 4 books from the Ender's Game series. Despite knowing there's much better sci-fi out there, the first Ender's Game book still somehow keeps its hold on me, and I want to keep rereading it.
I read one fantasy book in 2025, so I reread The Fellowship of the Ring. Love The Lord of the Rings, and I watch the movies pretty much every year with my family. And Tom Bombadil definitely makes that first book a joy to read, and I'm sad he's not in the movies, but and then my other sci-fi fantasy book was A Clockwork Orange, if you could kind of put this in the sci-fi genre. but it's really about this moral dilemma of stripping a person of their free will and if that actually makes them morally good. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from that book. But again, probably wouldn't reread that one. It's a bit dark.
Then I read Arch-Conspirator by Veronica Roth. This was an incredible and inventive retelling of Antigone that completely exceeded my expectations. And then I really got into Nnedi Okorafor. So I first read Noor, and it was fast-paced and fun, and the novel explores what it means to be human in a future where technology and biology blur together. Then I read Death of the Author. This was even better than Noor. This book within a book structure felt perfectly paced and was incredibly compelling. And I finished off with this author for this year. This was my favorite novel by Okorafor. It had a lovable protagonist, it had alien powers, sinister elites, and an ending that felt like a Marvel post-credits secret scene, which was very exciting. I read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. It's a fast-paced, fascinating classic with great world building, though like most classic sci-fi, the female characters were very disappointing. I read the Monk and Robot series by Becky Chambers. These two books were cozy comfort reads that genuinely lowered my stress levels during exam season. And the last sci-fi book I read this year was Orbital by Samantha Harvey. It's a stunning love letter to Earth that everyone should read as a reminder of how fragile and precious our planet is. It made it into one of my favorite sci-fi books of all time. Next, we have nonfiction. I read The Accidental Universe by Alan Lightman. I much prefer Lightman's fiction, as this nonfiction felt so watered down that I didn't learn anything new.
Yeah, and my non-fiction for this year was part 2 of Either Or by Kierkegaard. Probably my favorite philosophical/theological piece. It reads like you've discovered two geniuses' lost notebooks and letters that they sent to each other.
I read Down Below by Leonora Carrington, which is a nonfiction. It's a harrowing and deeply personal account of psychosis that I only wish had been longer.
Yeah, and then I read Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, which was another theological book, and it puts the crucifixion of Christ and the book of Revelation in a new perspective that was like really eye-opening for me. Yeah.
And then I read a fourth book by Nnedi Okorafor. This was a beautiful TED Talk memoir that deepened my understanding of her fiction. I loved her concept of a person's breaking and how breaking can lead to creativity and breakthrough. It was a great read. I also read Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. I read this because it was in the acknowledgments for The Mountain and the Sea. It's an endlessly fascinating book that taught me so much and convinced me that everyone should care more about octopuses and just love octopuses. I also read Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. This was a brilliant and still relevant examination of how media shapes politics, culture, and the way we think. I cannot view entertainment the same after reading this.
Yeah, in that same vein, I read Walden, and that was one of my favorite books of the year for sure. And it was like the best love letter to nature, apart from like Emerson, who also did that, and deserves to be taught more in schools, especially nowadays. Oh, and then I also read, in conjunction with that, Civil Disobedience. It's a shorter essay by Thoreau, and yeah, it's more about duty to society and society's duty to you, and not necessarily a must-read, but it was still good.
I read Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. This was an incredible speculative philosophical work on environmental futures, and I now need to read Haraway every year. She's easily my favorite philosopher that I've discovered. I also read Silence is So Deep by John Luther Adams. This composer's autobiography made me want to visit Alaska, but the writing itself didn't leave much of an impression. I also read The Mind-Gut Connection by Emmerin Mayer. This was a disappointing pop science read with weak evidence and troubling framing, especially around autism. Next is poetry and plays. We both read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. I thought this was a dense but extraordinary modernist poem about meaning after catastrophe that rewards rereading and research, and I plan to revisit this every year.
Yeah, and I also wrote that it was just beautifully haunting modernist poem and requires many rereads. And then I also read Waiting for Godot, which is also in that modernist vein. One of the weirdest books I think I read this year too. It's just two men stuck waiting for Godot, and it's hilarious, allegorical, and I loved every second of it.
I read Endgame, also by Beckett. This is funny, bleak, confusing, sad, and strangely beautiful. It's just classic Beckett, and it's still great even if I thought it wasn't as good as Waiting for Godot.
Right.
And then I reread Ariel by Sylvia Plath. Plath is simply unmatched, and this reread reminded me why she remains one of the most singular poetic voices ever. I just love her poetry so much.
Yeah, and then I read Macbeth, a story of murder, war, backstabbing, funny quotes, and witches thrown into the mix too. Something I want to come back to after learning more about the history of the time too. And then I also read another Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Perfect love story, famous for a reason.
Lastly, we have general fiction, so not classics. I read The Green Glass Sea and its sequel, which is White Sands Red Menace by Ellen Klages. This is a wonderful childhood reread for me, full of science, found family, and a strong young protagonist that was an absolute joy to read. I also read Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. It was a slow burn, speculative novel about grief that was deeply clever and deserved far more praise than I think it gets online. A book that should receive less praise is Tender is the Flesh. I genuinely wish I could go back in time and stop myself from reading this book. It was one of the most unpleasant reading experiences I have ever had. Similarly, another sort of popular book is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. This was shockingly misogynistic despite its mostly female cast, and another book I wish I'd skipped. This year, I learned my lesson. I'm never going to try reading trendy books ever again.
Yeah. And then this was actually the first book, or one of the first books I read in the year, was The Crying of Lot 49 by Pynchon. And it's about a woman who feels trapped searching for something, but she doesn't really know what she's searching for. So it's very mysterious, and I loved the writing.
I read Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco. This is a demanding but wildly engaging conspiracy labyrinth that made me want to read everything Eco ever wrote. I also read Memory Theater by Simon Critchley. This is a philosopher's descent into the space where enlightenment and madness meet, and it is an easy, enthusiastic recommendation to anyone. And then I also read Eastbound. This was beautifully written and emotionally devastating in the best way. This book completely consumed me over just a few sittings, and it was the most beautiful writing I read this year. So that's everything we read in 2025. Thanks for watching.